from 90 to 92, and I was number 3 in the mission, so I had a perspective of what was going on. And there's a wonderful old adage that says, you can't see the forest for the trees. We were so wrapped up in those trees, we didn't see any forest. We didn't have any clue as to what was going on. And it took a number of years later to develop a little bit of perspective and distance to be able to figure it out a little bit better. I entered my career in Romania after Ceausescu was given a rather summary exit plan, and very interesting assignment, and then I retired after 37 years. We have mandatory retirement at 65 in the Foreign Service. As you can imagine, I spent the last week or so rewriting a lot of stuff. Some of it I'm going to look back into a little bit of the history, and that stays the same, but what's happening right now is changing quickly. We'll start off with a couple of terms that we use in foreign affairs, and if you came to my talk, was it last year or the year before?
Last year was virtual. So.
Virtual, okay. I like a couple of different terms, and I think they're important in understanding foreign affairs. The first group is Idealists and Realists. We all know what conservatives and liberals are. We live with that, and much to our collective unhappiness right now, because there's no meeting of the minds on that subject. Well, in foreign affairs, it's idealists and realists. Idealists look at the values. What do we stand for? How do we want to feel good about ourselves as well as help other people? Realists look at much more pragmatic approach to this. What is our national interest? What can come of this? Neither of these is right or wrong, and it depends upon where you are in the world. Am I coming through clearly?
Sure.
Okay. My mask is slipping around here. One issue could really require an idealistic approach, another a realistic approach. The issue is you need to think in terms of what are the costs and consequences. And in terms of consequences, intended and unintended consequences. And all we have to do is look at Afghanistan to see what 20 years of idealistic approach did didn't do much for us, did it? The other factor I want to bring up is culture. I would suggest that in the United States, we have more than one culture. And we can recognize it somewhat between the various divides we're looking at right now. A rural-urban divide, a generational divide. A little bit of a geographical divide between the South and the North. In the rest of the world, it's even more profound, because all of those influences that go into building a culture take a long time to percolate before it really becomes defined as their culture. And in the case of Russia and the United States, we're really on very different sides of this. The third thing is geography. If you live in the mountains, you become rather parochial and isolated. If you live in the plains, you have a much more expansive outlook on life. Take that and multiply it. Look at our own definitions in the United States, where we have 2 oceans and 2 relatively friendly neighbors to be able to, for most of our existence in this country. Well, if you look at a country like Poland, which has been gobbled up by several countries over the centuries, they look at things a little bit differently from that geography. So geography is an important determinant in foreign affairs too. Tonight I'll look at several perspectives. The idealists, the realists, NATO / the US, because NATO for many purposes is the US, and Russia's perspectives. And speaking of perspectives, I have one. I tend to lean towards the realist side. So as you see what I'm saying, you'll say, aha, that's where he is, isn't it? And you need to look at as many perspectives as you can before you make up your mind how you want to look at this particular issue. If we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, well, I'll give you one perspective, and you can get others, and then you can decide where you want to be on that issue. I think you all have a better understanding of our own policy towards Russia. So I'll talk more to the issues and areas that are shaping Russian foreign policy today. And of course, we'll spend the bulk of our time looking at the situation in Ukraine. Angela Stent recently wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine. And Foreign Affairs is probably one of the best journals available for keeping up on what's going on in foreign affairs. Much more moderate. There's also Foreign Policy, which gets a bit more evangelical. She suggests that the current crisis in Russia and Ukraine has been 30 years in the making. 30 years ago was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of those former pieces of that Soviet Union, which had been pieces of Russia before that, became independent. And it was driven largely by who became the president of Russia, who was rebelling against the party bosses. Because the individual party in the republics had no power whatsoever. It was the Central Committee and the Politburo that was in charge. She further suggests, this is Angela Stent, that this possible confrontation, which is becoming more possible by the day, is about more than just Ukraine and NATO membership. That Putin wants to redefine the definitions that we in Europe put into effect after the collapse of the Soviet Union, bringing Russia back to its historic place in Europe and in world affairs. According to Stent, Putin sees the US as weak right now, politically divided, absorbing our inelegant departure from Afghanistan, and with an increasing concern about China. Putin may decide not to invade, and that still he hasn't invaded yet. We'll get to that later. But it is hard to imagine that he will be satisfied with backing off without getting some face-saving concessions. So let's go back to those 1990s. Those are good years, weren't they? Did the 1990s offer an opportunity to reform Russia and the former Soviet republics? Francis Fukuyama, who became quite famous in that period because he wrote a book about the end of history. And what he meant was that it was with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it ended a phase of history, which he thought was the renaissance now for democratic governments and the end of authoritarian governments. Well, many idealists would like to agree, although they're having a more difficult time right now because there's such a rise in the number of authoritarian governments. They would say that we are right to push for change in Russia and the former republics of the Soviet Union to allow the principles of democracy, human rights, and freedom to grow. Realists, while not dismissing those idealistic goals as important, would suggest that the closer we get to Russia's heartland, there was going to be a reaction. The Soviet Union I left in 1992 was in a state of kind of PTSD, if you know the term, post-traumatic syndrome disease. Even when Putin began to take control in 2000, he didn't have the resources to resist or project Russia's interests abroad. We largely got away with calling most of the shots until about 2004. Now, if you remember in 2004, there was a rather significant rise in the cost of energy. And the Russians were put together a nest egg of over $600 billion. Well, that gives you a little bit of room to play. If you like black or white solutions, diplomacy is not your game. Diplomats look at nuances and look for compromises. And they look for win-win solutions. Therefore, the desire to change the world to look like us has to be affected by strong and or negative reactions from the other side. Yes, we can support those democratic human rights goals, but they have to be tempered by realities on the ground. Remember, you can import democracy, but it's really hard to export it. Remember also that there are costs and consequences. It's a term you'll hear several times from me, for whatever policy you come up with, whether it's realist or idealist, and they have to be examined before you make the policy, not as you're going along. So Putin put together a huge financial base, but ran into trouble in 2015. Russia had to dig into its reserves to cover its budgetary shortfall because of the severe drop in energy revenues, as well as the costs associated with the sanctions, the drop in the value of the ruble, the national currency, and the cost of Russia's activities in Ukraine, Crimea, and in Syria. Now, because of the pandemic, supply chain issues, and the threat of a cold winter, the price of all energy-related products has risen sharply. As a result, Russia is rebuilding their sovereign fund, is what that nest egg is called, allowing Putin to be more assertive in general and disruptive when it comes to his relationship with the United States. All those little definitions along the side are former republics of the Soviet Union. The Russians refer to them as the near abroad. They don't really think of them as foreign countries. Looking at other parts of the former Soviet Union, before we focus in on Ukraine, over the last year, Russia's control over, over Belarus, right up there, has increased significantly to the point that I wouldn't be surprised if there could be talks in the near future about absorbing Belarus into Russia. The president there has played a game, Lukashenko has played a game trying to play off the West against Russia, and it backfired on him. And now he went crawling back to Moscow, and he is firmly back in that orbit. Currently, there is a major Russian military presence there, which could allow a two-front opportunity if Russia were to invade Ukraine. Those military exercises are certainly a reminder to Belarus leaders and potential protesters that Mother Russia is close at hand. On the east side of that country, which goes down, well, up in Belarus is up here, there was a piece of Poland that Stalin took after World War II, and then gave both Poland and it was Czechoslovakia at that time, a piece of Germany after World War II. Those little pieces in Ukraine and in Belarus have been a thorn in the side of the Soviets for most of the early post-war years, and are definitely part of the agitation against the regimes in both Minsk and in Kiev. Okay, Moldova is a small little country, primarily a Romanian ethnic and speaking country that has been at times part of that country. The critical factor there is that the Russian military controls an area called the Transdniester. The Dniester is a river that runs down through Moldova into the Black Sea. And it's that piece of land that then butts up against Ukraine is controlled by Russia and is not likely to give it up anytime soon. There have been important adjustments in the Caucasus. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Georgia lost 2 territories to Russia. And unfortunately, it was a self-inflicted wound because the Georgians decided they were going to retake 2 provinces that had been declared semi-independent. And when they moved on them, Russia stepped in. And they used that was back in 2008. Armenia recently lost some very emotional territory to Azerbaijan in the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh area of Azerbaijan. So it's right in that where that mark is. It's not on the border, it's inside the territory of Azerbaijan. The stands. That's all of that Central Asia, Kazakhstan, all of them have one thing in common. The last part of their name is Stan. The collapse of Afghanistan, another Stan, is working to make Russia important for securing the borders of several stands that border Afghanistan. Also, Russia has increased the ease and the number of people from the stands who want to work in Russia, doing the kind of jobs that Russians don't want to do anymore. Stand politicians are concerned about radical activity coming across the border, and this has helped a great deal in terms of building a relationship with Moscow, who is there to help them. And recently, Kazakhstan had some demonstrations that Russia came in, very quickly put down the demonstrations, and very quickly left. So it was a nice, clean move on the part of the Russians. It brought the leadership much closer to Moscow's interest and control. Turkey is also active there, having ethnic and linguistic connections to that. And in fact, while I was back in Moscow in the early 90s, we were encouraging the Turks to become active in that area, largely because we didn't think we were going to be as successful as they might be. The trouble that the Turks are having right now is that they're everywhere. They're out there. If you look at the all the places that they're active in the world right now, mostly in the Middle East and South Asia, but it spreads broadly. They're into Europe, and their economy can't support it. Their economy is in deep trouble. So they're not likely to be an important player going forward. I didn't mention the Baltics. Way up at the top up there. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, because they do not have a long historical Russian identity. And except for the Russians who live there now, they are more integrated into Europe. Russia has launched several cyber attacks there to remind the Balts that Moscow is still there. Also, the economic life of Russians there, and there are a large number. The city of Riga, when I was there in the 90s, was 51% Russian. And a number of the Balts were sent off into Siberia under Stalin, and a number of Russians moved in. So this was a forced migration in both ways. The economic life of the Russians there in the Baltics is much better than what they would find across the border in Russia. And the EU keeps a close eye on them to make sure that minority rights are respected. So they can't start, there was a lot of talk at the beginning that they were going to force those Russians out of the country, but they also wanted to be part of the EU, and doing so meant that they had to step that down. All right. The key for Russia, however, is Ukraine. Back in 2020, when we began our struggle with the pandemic, I thought that given energy shortages, rising energy prices, and European disinclination to get involved in this conflict, that was likely that Moscow would get more aggressive, considering the increase in financial reserves that they have put together recently. Well, 2 months into 2022, that assessment is looking pretty good. As we look at this map, it is useful to our discussion to note that there are 12 million Russians who found themselves in the new Ukrainian state. In 1991, Putin wrote, or had someone write, a 5,000-word essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. I think it is fair to point out that Ukraine became part of Russia in 1654. They had been part of Poland up to that time, and it was a question of religion. The Catholic Poles were trying to convert the Ukrainians from Orthodoxy to Catholicism. So they made the shift and they became part of Russia. They weren't called Ukraine anymore. It was a geographical designation, but they were part of Russia. So since 1654, Ukraine had been part of Russia. The important point there is that over that span of time, much longer than we've been a country, they have had a common culture. So the kinds of things you see that are happening in Moscow are the kinds of things that are happening in Ukraine, except for that area that I told you that Stalin took after World War II, because that was Polish, and they have a different cultural value system. They're not Western European, as we're seeing by the amount of issues that Hungary and Poland are having with the EU, with Brussels, in terms of trying to tell them what they have to do. I guess the way to put it is they gave up Moscow as their master, and now Brussels wants to become their master. It is not surprising that the leaders in Ukraine might want to separate themselves from Russia. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing. This is a chance for people people who are politically oriented to rise up in stature and be in importance. But I think that if we think that Ukrainians are going to develop more democratic practices and incorporate the kind of transparent and market-oriented economic practices that we endorse, all you have to do is look at the several governments that have been in power to see the kind of practices that characterize Russian politics are present in Kiev as well. It's the same culture. It's not that, there's nothing wrong with our wanting to help them become democratic and market-oriented. The issue becomes, how long do you need to do that in order to be able to make it take effect? Look at the Afghan, where we were going into a 14th century country and trying to make Democrats out of them. It just doesn't work. Okay, enough on that. Changing governments is relatively easy, certainly easier than changing one's culture. Ukrainian internal politics reflects the ethnic divide, with the current president Zelensky under attack by pro-West and pro-Russia group parties. What's interesting in the pro-Moscow group is they're now looking for a neutral Ukraine. Now, the subject will come up. Ukraine has been distancing itself from the Minsk agreements that were put together to try and resolve this by Britain, France, and Germany. I don't think we were involved in that. The idea was to create greater autonomy for the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. Ukraine is objecting on two accounts. One is the seizure of Crimea, and I'll get into that in a minute. The other is that would mean a permanent block on Ukraine ever becoming part of NATO, because they could vote it down. On the subject of Crimea, Crimea was part of Russia since 1750 when they took it from the Turks. If you look at the the movement of Russian history, it is not dissimilar to our own in ways. You move into areas, you pacify the areas, immigrants come in, settlers come in, and you populate it. That's largely the way in which Russia developed as well, except they had many more. When you got down into Central Asia, what the Russians would do, as the Soviets did, is they would find a tribe that was on the outs and embrace them, and they then would be the vehicle to taking control. But what do you do about Crimea? Right now they're building a bridge. But that bridge cannot supply all the administrative support that Ukraine had been providing. And that's another point. Khrushchev in 1955, after Stalin died, when he became the premier, assigned the administrative control of Crimea to Ukraine rather than Russia. It sounds like it's a big deal. It was not a big deal because the republics had no power whatsoever. Yeltsin, who was the president of the first secretary of the Russian Federation, wasn't part of the Politburo. He was part of the Central Committee. So those leaders of those republics were rather inconsequential through most of the Soviet period. They were even less important in the Tsarist period. So part of it is understanding I know where our policy is coming from, but I think it's useful for people to hear the other side of the story as to why that's going to be a problem. Well, if Putin decides to take more Ukrainian territory, and he's on the edge of it right now, and we'll get to that in a second. What are the costly consequences for Moscow, for NATO, and for the US? We are looking at just such a possibility. If Europe has no energy alternative, what would they say or do? And we're seeing some of the talk on it right now that's much more careful than our own. What would we do? It is unlikely that we would go to war over Ukraine. First of all, they are not a NATO member. We'll get into the NATO part of this because that's an important aspect. I just don't see more in the way of effective economic sanctions, or that we could generate enough energy supplies to give Europe a reason for anything beyond those sanctions. In the longer term, I suspect that we will give up trying to change Ukrainian culture before Russia throws in the towel. Let's go to NATO. There was a swift expansion of NATO into the former members of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia at that time, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Further, there have been intermittent efforts to expand it further into Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. Though European interest goes up and down, and U.S. interest, especially on the subject of Ukraine, is more supportive of Ukrainians than Europe in general. The problem is Article 5, coming to the defense of any member. That article has only been brought into effect once, and it was 9/11. And that was one of the reasons that NATO went into Afghanistan. It was in support of U.S., one of the members. The other issue is Article 10 of the Charter that opens NATO membership to any country in Europe who wants to join and meets the standards. When the NATO Charter was written, the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. That wasn't considered to be Europe. That was considered the Soviet Union. So, and logically, that was not intended, but now it has become useful in terms of trying to reduce Russia's influence to be able to push NATO forward in this process. The map of the energy dependence plays into NATO questions and overall relations with Russia. Some EU countries are entirely dependent on Russia for natural gas. Overall, Russia covers over 30% of all primary energy imports of the European Union. 30%. Recognizing that over half of all its energy is imported from the EU, that's Germany. There's been talk of shipping liquid gas to Europe. Well, European ports are not capable yet, and won't be immediately, because it takes a long time to build up the capacity, the capability of bringing in that liquid gas. So when you hear that tossed out, ask the question, well, when would that happen? It wouldn't be enough to take care of what their needs are this year. And that's why Germany is reluctant to push too hard, is one of the least interested in pushing this particular agenda item with Ukraine. It's rather dark, isn't it? Okay. China has had a complicated and evolving relationship with Russia. There has been a historical competition, especially in Russia's Far East, marked by a 7-month conflict, which you may not remember, between the Soviet Union and China in 1969. That was followed by the Sino-Soviet split, which gave a certain president and a certain national security advisor the opportunity to open up China to the United States. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. For now, I would call China a default ally of Russia. The degree of cooperation is somewhat dependent on what we do, especially if we amp up our competition with China. In recent years, the two countries, Russia and China, have gravitated closer towards each other amid their deteriorating relations with the West. For Russia, a pivot to the world's second largest economy was a natural solution to sanctions over its annexation of Crimea and incursions into eastern Ukraine in 2014. Actually, it's not incursions in, it was the support of groups within Ukraine, to be accurate. And Beijing was more than happy to embrace closer ties with its northern neighbor as tensions escalated in almost every aspect of its relations with the U.S. The recent Olympic Games in China was a showcase for the developing relations with Moscow, with the two leaders signing an agreement and making a statement with several other more authoritarian leaders present as the West boycotted the Olympics. And keep this thought in the back of your mind. The democracies, the authoritarian countries. That wasn't the way in which we defined the world during the Cold War, but it could be a template for where we're going forward. Elsewhere in Asia, Russia is always looking for opportunities to frustrate us. It doesn't take as much resources to frustrate as it does to go in and do something. As we have been strengthening our relationship with India, as they are members of something called the Quad. Have you heard that term, the Quad?
Yeah, we had a section on.
Oh, you did? Wow. Okay. With Australia and Japan, we have found that our relations with Pakistan have been deteriorating. The animosity between these two countries makes it near impossible to have good relations with both. Russia has picked up on this shift and improved their relations with the Pakistanis. With the focus on Ukraine, China, and the pandemic, the Middle East in general, and Syria as an example, have dropped off many radars, except for yours, Dr. Savage. The Abraham Accords, an interesting way in which the indigenous countries of the region have found a way in which to work with Israel. And this is popping up increasingly in the discussion. Partly it has to do with Iran and the Sunni majority in most of the Middle East coming together to oppose Iran's more aggressive and more aggressive policies. Most of the countries of the Middle East are authoritarian, giving Russia a slight advantage in relationships. In fact, most of the countries in the world are authoritarian. A guy named, I think it's from the Brookings Institute, wrote a piece in which he said, it's it's not the authoritarians who have to be concerned. It's the democracies, because that's an uphill fight to be able to keep democracies active and functioning as they're supposed to function. And we know right now how difficult it is here at home to put a democracy to work. Russia's interest in Africa is growing, as is China's, primarily through mercenaries like the Wagner Group. They are present in Libya and Central African Republic and Mozambique. They go in to do the dirty work for countries that are having, what we could call it wet work, for countries that are having problems internally with dissidents and revolutions and opposing ethnic groups. Several of these countries are going through severe unrest, so the efficacy of these relations is in flux. But Russia doesn't, except for Syria, Russia doesn't have a permanent approach to this. It's more in terms of a little bit here, a little bit there. China has been active there as well, but its goals are developing mineral energy sources. And you've heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, that's the vehicle that they're using. While certain key minerals like platinum, palladium, gold, and uranium can be cheaper for Russia to import from Africa, Russia's goal is more to build its reputation as a great power. And if Russia did nothing else through this whole several weeks that we've gone on, they have made themselves a world power, a major player on the world scene. I won't say major power, but a major player on the world scene. Also, as a consequence of sanctions, Africa and Latin America are potential markets for agricultural products. In Latin America, the focus is on Venezuela and Cuba, or Cuba, as my Boston friends would say. But other factors that apply to Africa are relevant there as well. Recently, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Moscow, of Russia, suggested that Russia may send troops to Latin America after we announced that we were sending troops to Eastern Europe. The press secretary to the White House was very upset about that. I don't remember her exact words, but she should have contacted former Secretary Kerry, who said that the Monroe Doctrine was dead. We have heard a lot about Russian interference in our political affairs, attempts to undermine our economic life. The point I'll make is Russia cannot compete with us, never had been able to compete with us economically. Their tools are much cruder. So they use the cyber capabilities in order to, as a way to counter what they see we're doing to them. We don't think we're doing anything to them. That's a different issue. Russia has issues with the cyber world. It also includes social media. Russia is currently going after social media outlets, like a lot of countries. China's doing the same. Authoritarian countries are closing down on social comment. And Russia has put in place lawsuits against Facebook, Google, Twitter, Telegram, and TikTok. That's a Chinese company. In July, Moscow claimed to have simulated a physical disconnecting of the Russian internet segment from the global network. I don't know if that was actually true, but that's what they're claiming. Though there has been little said about what we are doing, we can assume that we have and are doing some of the same kinds of things. If you recall, a rather embarrassing moment during the Obama administration when it was called, when the Chancellor of Germany's cell phone was bugged by us. Countries spy on their adversaries and even on their friends. Intelligence can be critical to making the right decision or pursuing the right policy. There's a difference between gathering intelligence and acting on intelligence. I would say Russia is more guilty on the second part than we are, generally. But we've had our. There's someone from Chase Mellon University that came up with 77 occasions where we interfered actively in other countries' affairs. I'm not apologizing for it. I'm not saying it's a wonderful thing. It's a fact of life in international affairs. Every embassy has a station, and the head of the station is from the CIA. In controlled states like China and Russia, there is better integration between official and hacker communities. Several years ago, I gave a talk on cyber issues. At that time, the hackers were strongest in Ukraine, Russia, Brazil, and were primarily criminal in intent. China's capacity was built from within the military. The countries that with the most developed cyber warfare capabilities currently are the United States, China, Russia, Israel, and the UK. Iran and North Korea are catching up. There is a serious difference of opinion as to whether that brief thaw in the relations in the early 1990s had a chance of succeeding. I hold that we confuse collapse paralysis with willingness to accept our democratic overhaul. NATO expansion, which went through numerous definitions and interpretations as we endorsed expanding NATO through the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe, up to the current debate about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. From Moscow's perspective, eventually this expansion was seen by Russia as an attempt to surround it. One of Biden's major foreign policy goals is the largely successful restoring relations with allies, achieving Western unity, and promoting democratic principles. This standoff with Russia is testing our relations with Europe, since there is a range of attitudes towards Russia there, ranging from the Baltics and Poland, that are probably most alarmed, to Germany, that has serious Russian energy needs, to Hungary, which has been most open to Moscow, possibly because of its skirmishing with the EU. Germany also has enormous business interest in Russia, and that goes back for a long period of time. The democracy promotion runs the risk of dividing the world into democracies and authoritarian regimes. And there are more of the latter. It also pushes Russia and China closer together, giving Moscow an important outlet for its energy and an economic power to cover its needs. According to the recent Russian national security strategy, I did not get a personal copy, Russia has deprioritized relations with the West, focusing on the near abroad. Those are the former republics of the Soviet Union. China, India, and non-Western institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Have you heard of the term BRICS? BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and it could be both South Korea and South Africa as being the points where Russia is putting its emphasis. It sounds much like the policies during the Cold War, appealing to the world in more authoritarian countries. Ukraine remains the biggest, largest obstacle to improved relations. Biden has reinvigorated strategic partnership program with Ukraine, provided more support, weapons, training, but the weakness of our expectation is that the question, can Ukraine change the culture and apply the kind of democracy reforms we expect in a time frame that we're willing to stay there? Though it has had elections since 1993, it can hardly be called a democracy, showing the kind of cultural behavior that is far closer to Moscow than Washington, D.C. Up to this conflict in Ukraine, it was fair to say that Russia was limited in shaping outcomes, but it was able to complicate and prolong various conflicts, the goal being to keep the U.S. spread thin, fighting small fires around the world. Referred to it as poking us in the eye. There are numerous ideas, solutions out on the internet. Good God, I've never seen so much verbiage on a particular issue in the last 30 years. Everyone's opining, and I'll be opining too. Most of those ideas that are out there flow from national interest or the values of the writer's home base. And here are a few of the more restrained ideas. George Friedman, who's the head of a group called Geopolitical Futures, notes that at this point, it's smoke and mirrors. And the smoke and mirrors he's referring to is, we'll send 500 troops or 5,000 troops here, they'll send something over here, they'll move over here. Well, that might be overtaken by the announcements of the last 2 days. The U.S. says Russia will attack. Russia says it won't. One of them is lying or wrong, says George. Either way, the U.S. is drumming up war fever. It may be designed to keep allies like Germany in line, but it's hard to see how shouting fire but not gathering fire engines will install confidence to rally allies in the United States side. That's George Friedman's. In line with Friedman's assessment, look at what the NATO countries are doing to offset Russian troop buildup, an aggressive diplomatic approach. They are sending modest amounts of defensive supplies to Ukraine, providing training but not units that are going to Eastern Europe, which really, I think, is a stretch to think in terms of Russia interested in taking back the former Warsaw Pact countries. And they are more a public relations effort than a meaningful deterrent. Jeffrey Sachs, who was very, very much in play in the 90s and the economic revisions within the Warsaw Pact countries, and then came over to Moscow to find out it was a different place. He's come up with a suggestion. It's an Austrian type of solution for Ukraine. And in 1955, NATO brokered a Austrian constitutional law, which the Austrians embraced, which makes them a neutral country. So they're not part of any bloc. The problem there is Austria was happy to pass that law. That meant all those troops that had been hanging around there would leave the country. And those were our troops and Soviet troops as well. I doubt that Ukraine would be willing to pass a similar law to that. Former colleagues have pointed out to me that Ukraine would probably be denied NATO membership because it has a contested border. And that's one of the parts of it's not spelled out as is in the words of Article 10, but a contested border is one of the issues involved. So, especially now, with Russia recognizing the independence of those two enclaves. And I'll get into that. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Where are we now? I've been rewriting this section for the last week. There have been several exchanges of positions, numerous meetings with several heads of state traveling broadly to try to influence the process and also get a little bit of visibility for themselves and to avoid war. There was a formal response from Moscow on February 17th, responding to U.S. security proposals. Some experts suggest that there were no compromises to earlier Russian proposals, nor was there a willingness to limit the focus of topics to arms control, which is what we wanted to do. Moscow said that it will be forced to implement military technical measures if their earlier responses are not met. Also on the 17th, Russia expelled the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission. I don't know how this is connected, but having gone through a period where colleagues were being called PNG'd, persona non grata, it's a fact of life in the Foreign Service. On February 19th and 20th, President Macron seemed to have brokered an agreement with Biden and Putin to meet again, only to be overtaken by Russia's move into the breakaway parts of the Donbass. Now, as I understand it, they actually haven't gone in there, but what they have recognized is that they have recognized the independence. But they're also saying it's not just that piece of territory that is where they are in control, where the separatists are in control. It's the whole, it's called the oblast, the whole Donetsk and what's the other one? No, there's Luhansk. And they want that whole area. If we don't have the map, I'll go back to that map. There is a river that runs through here. And I believe it goes down to that's the Sea of Azov. No, it's got to go down into the Black Sea. Yeah. There's a river runs through there. That would give, if Russia were to take that territory, then it would give them administrative control over Crimea. It wouldn't have to take Kiev to do so. Who knows what that's going to, I don't have any idea. The Wall Street Journal reported that President Biden said his administration will levy sanctions on Russian banks and individuals in response to President Putin's movement of troops into the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine. I'm not sure that he's actually done that yet. Calling Moscow's moves the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. One of the interesting things when we talk about the sanctions is something that's actually going on around us. Maybe some of you are already involved in it. It's called cryptocurrency. There is total anonymity with cryptocurrency. So if I were an oligarch sitting in Moscow, I would have already planted a whole bunch of my money in cryptocurrencies where no one could get their hands on. Sanctions have never been a popular, I mean, yes they are. They are very popular because you're doing something. But they have never been popular amongst those who judge the efficacy of them because they've rarely been effective. Ukrainian President Zelensky has urged calm. That was before yesterday. Kiev and its Western parties were waiting to see whether the Russian forces entering the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics would try to punch through Ukrainian positions in the coming days. Germany has said it's halted moves invented the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Well, it hasn't been producing energy for them yet, and so it's not a big deal right now. But that's easily turned around. They're not talking about dismantling the infrastructure. They're just saying we're suspending. The EU is imposing sanctions on most members of the Russian Duma, and it has agreed to a ban on the purchase of Russian government bonds, as well as prohibiting trade in new Russian debt on EU security markets. Well, that's kind of it's offset to a degree by the amount of money flowing into Russian coffers because of the higher price of energy supplies. I don't know that I'm not going to make a suggestion that it offsets it, but there is a relationship. Does Russia want to recapture all that was Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union? Okay. I still see Russia willing to live with tolerant, if not friendly, neighbors. Largely because many of those former republics were a drain on Moscow's economic well-being. There was an outflow to those places of resources. At the danger of sounding like an economist, on the one hand and on the other hand, one of the cultural aspects of Russian culture that differs from our own very, very, very significantly is that politics trumps economics. It doesn't even come close. They are willing to sacrifice economic advantage for political gain. So my pragmatic assessment of Moscow's economic interest may not be relevant. Also, sanctions and the drain they have on the economy are really not as important as strategic goals or political considerations, as I said. The kind of individual outrage that we would expect in the United States, or better put, as we are seeing in the United States, unlikely is a culture that puts the interest of the group, the nation, before the individual. That is an authoritarian culture. The group is more important than the individual. I'm not trying to say that demonstrations don't occur. They have been a factor in Russian historical life. But in the end, the effect of those demonstrations have been very minor, until they ignite into something like the Russian Revolution. There were occasionally periods when there were major peasant revolts. They were put down, and then life went back to as usual. With the center, in the Tsar's time, it was if I could only tell the Tsar what's happening. There are many reasonable perspectives on what should be done. However, they must depend on where you are in the world. But whether you're in Washington, Franklin, Moscow, Kiev, London, Beijing, Berlin, or Paris. Your view may be slightly to seriously different. Even in those countries, there are a range of positions. In the West, those positions are often much more vocal because you can bring them out. In a place like Moscow, that kind of open, by disagreeing with my government, it just wouldn't be possible this way. It is possible, but it won't be effective, and I will only do it one time. Our differences for those of us in the West stem often from that idealist versus realist construct that I cited several times. The world we find today is changing. The world order has been in place since World War II, this economic order. It was created by us with a little help from our wartime allies. Russia, China, India, and the Third World in general did not participate in creating the rules for that order. Russia was never, the Soviet Union was never in a position to challenge that because they were not economically powerful enough. China is. There's great concern about the rise of authoritarian governments in the world. What they should be saying is that brief expansion of democratic governments that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union is slowing. I would suggest that a primary reason for that is the level of uncertainty in the world. And many countries are tightening up their own domestic situation as they begin to grapple with regional and global issues. We are not the player we were 30 years ago, when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. We are still the largest economy, we're the most powerful military, but we don't have the same sway that we had 30 years ago. What happens in Ukraine may be a larger marker for other places in the world, like Taiwan. And this is one of the things that policymakers are concerned about. Is this an invitation for China to do something about Taiwan? In the end, we need to determine what our goals in our relations with the various players should be. Decide on a policy, think through the costs and consequences before we announce a policy. We are not going to change Russian culture anytime soon. It has changed little through czarist and communist and present governance. We were not likely to be allies or friends after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Our cultures, our values, our governance are too different, but we could be more competitors than adversaries. But there are some new, very quickly I'll go through the latest announcements that were just hot off the press. Russia has formally recognized Eastern Ukraine separatists as independent states, adding that the rebels' claims include the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Putin and the EU are suggesting further talks, though we are less interested. Could be similar to the way the 2008 Georgian conflict was resolved, when Russia moved in and they said and were agreeable to talks, and Georgia did lose permanently those two, well, for what's permanent in international affairs, for the time being, those two oblasts, those two breakaway republics. Russia announced the evacuation of its Ukraine embassy staff. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, called up reservists from, was it 18 to 60? There's a few of you here. And told the Ukrainians in Russia that urged them to come home. With a contested border that largely ends Ukrainian chances of getting into NATO, or maybe not. Western reaction so far has been mild. Even the suspension of the Nord Stream can be reversed easily. Moscow may be able to defeat some of the effects of the sanctions through cryptocurrencies. Tougher measures could be banning exports of strategic tech, targeting larger Russian banks, or cutting Russia off with something called SWIFT, S-W-I-F-T, it's an acronym. It's a messaging system for electronic payments. But I'm also told that Russia has already come up with a standby mechanism if that were to happen. So with that, thank you very much. I'm very patient. Yes.
Okay, hold on a second. We'll take questions until 8 o'clock. If you've asked a question, please give everybody a chance to ask a question before you ask the second question.
Okay. Aggie was up first. I'll come back to you. Yes.
I guess I'm going to change my second question to my first now. When Ukraine was broken off of the Soviet Union, if I remember right, they were maybe the fourth largest nuclear power.
Yes.
And some fool told them to get rid of those.
Yes, we did. Not only that, we did it. We helped them to get rid of those weapons. Interesting point. Think of what's the African country whose leader gave up his nuclear weapons? Libya. Well, yeah, and that's why North Korea is not giving up their weapons. What you have is a deterrent as well as an offense. That's a good point.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation. What can Ukraine do to poke Russia in the eye?
Not much. Not much.
How about if they lop off those two oblasts and say, okay, we recognize you. You know, they hold elections, they become part of the Soviet Union, and then Ukraine turns around and joins NATO.
No, that still won't happen.
Still on.
No, first of all, there's going to be a contested area.
Yeah, right.
Small countries, and I use Poland at the beginning in terms of being surrounded by, have to be very careful. Big countries can be arrogant, and often are. So Ukraine has very little. When taking the Crimea away was a big deal, because that's where the Russian fleet was. That always had been the Russian fleet.
Khrushchev was Ukrainian.
No, he wasn't.
Oh,
He had done his World War II duty in Ukraine, and so he might have bent over backwards on that account. But administratively, it made perfect sense that Ukraine, which was the closest to Crimea, would be there. But the Russians will never. Crimea is a special place in the Russian heart. Lots of literature written about in connection with Crimea. Yes.
You mentioned about something giving up, like a compromise. In 1962, we did compromise with Russia when we threatened President Kennedy said that we will sink the ships when Russia was deploying the missiles in Cuba with the permission of Fidel Castro. But it was not made public, but we did make compromise by taking
Turkey.
Turkey, right?
Yes, the Turkish.
And at the same time, will there be compromises now?
Well, if they're going to be effective, we're not going to hear about them for a while. The whole trouble with these kinds of, with all of this information flow is that nothing is being done quietly and reasonably. Everyone gets onto hobby horses. In elections, in the democracies are always occurring, and you have to get your right positions in order. And right now, I mean, I saw that Pelosi is just has complimented Biden, but I didn't hear any Republicans that were complimenting him on his policies. They don't think he's doing enough on this issue. So we're caught up in our domestic games as well as we're trying to run a foreign policy.
Is Russia more formidable than years ago?
Sorry?
Is Russia now more formidable than years ago?
Yes. It is more formidable than it has been, probably even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, because in many ways we built up the image of the Soviet Union because it was in the interest of a lot of organizations to make them a major player. And what we found out after it was all over, we got access through some Russians to some of the archives. We found out that they weren't nearly as credible as we thought they were. But they built up budgets for various places like the State Department and the CIA and the military.
Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You didn't mention about that also, but Germany is a very good importer of gas and oil from Russia.
30%.
Many of the small countries, they totally depend on Russia for gas and oil.
Absolutely.
So if we put an embargo on sanctions on Russia, then actually we are getting hurt, or Nato.
And President Biden said in his remarks, I think yesterday or today, that there's going to be a price that we're going to have to pay for higher energy, and inflation is already moving. So, cost and consequences. Yes.
Looking back on the past couple decades of Putin's career as president, do you think he was always fundamentally anti-Western and kind of revanchist, and that's just now coming out, or have events kind of made him increasingly that way?
I actually met him in St. Petersburg. He was the CIA person assigned to the mayor of St. Petersburg, and I was up there with a delegation from Washington to call on the mayor, and he kept bouncing in and out. I hardly thought I was going to see him as the president of Russia at some point. I see him as a pragmatist. He's not ideological. Most of the KGB gave up on ideology a long time ago. They were much more pragmatic, but he is also, he can be ruthless, but part of Russian culture is ruthless. And I think we pushed him into several of these things. There were quiet assurances given by Baker and others that once we got Germany together, we weren't going to push further. And then we pushed. And then we continued to push. And this is where our idealism comes in. I guess I don't see the efficacy of trying to put together a foreign policy based on making the rest of the world look like us. I think we have seen people come from all over the world, and when they come here, largely they begin to absorb our culture. But when you have large groups of people who have a different culture, and you're coming in and saying to them, you need to change, well, you'll find pieces of that within that group that will be interested. But moving a culture is a decades-long process, maybe century-long process. I knew there was a question up here. This lady.
Okay, so you suggested, and maybe you can tell us your personal opinion, the USA is completely different than it was 30 years ago. In what respect?
Well, we are having a culture war of sorts between people who want a culture that was a part of our past, largely defined along who were the people who were there at the time. And we have an urban generational issue with that. We're sorting out this stuff. We have gone through it before. We went through it with Vietnam, where we had a culture clash. It wasn't just the war. It was also a cultural issue between generations at that time. We probably have gone through it before in other times as well. I tend to know more about other countries' history. I've been to more countries than states. Yes?
What would happen if the people in Stalin taken parts that you were talking about and the rest of Ukraine would vote where they wanted to go? What do you think would happen if the people got to vote? I know that's a Democrat.
It's also 70 years since World War II. So we're talking about several generations who have lived there. It's a complicated question. I don't know for a fact, but it would not come as a surprise that the leaders of the demonstrations in Kiev and in Minsk came from that part of the country. They have been the most aggressively anti-Soviet and the more aggressive anti-Russian. They were Polish or Czech. Probably Slovak, because it was Czechoslovakia, and Slovakia would have been that side of it. So, yeah.
I'm wondering if you could compare the Russian reaction to current events in the context of the American Monroe Doctrine. That's a big one.
Well, I mentioned John Kerry, who said that the Monroe Doctrine no longer exists. Well, and then the White House came out and said, if they send troops there, we're going to be very concerned. Yes, of course, great powers. This goes back to small powers and great powers. Maybe what we need to do is homogenize the world. No one can be larger than them. But then we'll figure out another way in which to fight with each other.
Yeah.
This is a troubled time internationally. The international agreements are under assault. Leaders of countries, especially in the more authoritarian places, have the ability to be able to put in place their reaction to it. Mr. Erdogan is all over the place, pushing Turkey's interests. But he's acting very much in control at home. India, even though we are part of the Quad with them, has been showing rather authoritarian impulses themselves. Now remember, India has been a democracy since Britain colonized them. That doesn't necessarily stay. It depends upon, democracy requires stability. And in order to be able to have a stable environment, you have to have a functioning and predictable economy. You have to be able to say, people have to say, I can see that if I work hard, I can do this, this, and this. I may not be totally successful in that regard, but that's what's part of the American dream. The ability to work hard and get ahead. I came from Forest Home Avenue and 20th Street, St. Adalbert's Parish, and worked my way through college, did graduate work, and I was a successful diplomat of the United States. Thank you all very much.